The sun blazed mercilessly over the barren stretch of desert, its heat pressing down like a physical weight on the small team of Navy SEALs crouched low against the sand. The horizon shimmered in waves of distortion, and every breath felt like inhaling fire. They had been on the move for 20 hours straight, deep behind enemy lines, with a mission so classified that even they had been given fragments of the full story. What they did know was enough. They were to extract a captured intelligence officer before she was moved across the border. The mission had gone smoothly until the extraction point. Then, everything fell apart. When the first explosion hit, it wasn't from enemy fire. The sound was different, sharper, closer, contained. The ground shook, and one of the men was thrown off his feet. In that instant, realization hit like a cold wave. They hadn't walked into an ambush. They had walked into something worse, a minefield. The area, mapped incorrectly by outdated satellite images, was a deadly patch of hidden explosives buried beneath the shifting sands. Each grain of desert was now a potential death trap. The team froze. Training kicked in, but instinct screamed louder. The air filled with the acrid scent of burning metal and disturbed dust. No one moved, no one spoke. Their eyes darted from one another, silently confirming what they all feared. The mine that detonated had been triggered by pressure. Just one step, one misplaced boot. Somewhere ahead lay more of them, invisible and waiting. The extraction was impossible now. Their vehicle was gone, destroyed in the blast. The comms unit had been damaged in the chaos. They were stranded, isolated, disoriented, surrounded by the kind of silence that could kill. Every second stretched into an eternity. The radio crackled faintly with static, but there was no signal. They tried to reach command, to send a distress call, but the jammer set up by enemy scouts earlier in the mission still blanketed the area. The SEALs were ghosts in a sea of sand, alive, but unseen, unheard, and unaccounted for. The nearest friendly unit was over 20 miles away, and the sun was already sinking. Once night fell, the desert would transform into an entirely different battlefield, freezing cold, pitch black, and crawling with insurgent patrols. The leader of the team, a seasoned operator with years of combat experience, surveyed the ground carefully. His mind ran through the checklist: stability, perimeter, possible paths of retreat. But nothing looked safe. Each footprint they had left behind could mark the edge of a buried explosive. The minefield wasn't marked, wasn't mapped, and wasn't supposed to be there. One wrong move, and they would vanish in a flash of fire and shrapnel. Sweat dripped down his temple, not from heat, but from the crushing realization that there was no easy way out. The silence was broken only by the faint clicking of metal as the wind brushed against their gear. Every man stood still, afraid to even shift his weight. Dust hung in the air like smoke, and the ground seemed to breathe beneath them. The medic, kneeling beside the wounded teammate from the initial blast, was trembling, not from fear, but from the impossible precision her job now required. 1 inch too far, one misplaced tool, and the entire team could be gone. The injured man's leg was bleeding badly, the mine's shrapnel tearing deep into muscle. He needed evacuation, but any attempt to move him could trigger another explosion. Time lost meaning in that moment. The team's training taught them to adapt, to overcome, to never surrender. But this was a trap nature itself seemed to have built. The sun, the sand, the silence, all of it pressed in, as if the desert wanted them buried beneath it. The oppressive heat turned their water supplies into lukewarm rations, and the rising wind threatened to erase what few visual markers they had managed to create. Every second without movement felt like a small victory, but also a countdown toward disaster. One of the SEALs tried to scan for tripwires using a knife and cord, slowly tracing the ground before him. It was a slow, agonizing process, and after a few minutes, even that movement stopped. The team leader gave a hand signal, freeze. They all froze again. The faint metallic ping that followed was unmistakable. Somewhere close, beneath the sand, something had shifted. Maybe the wind, maybe the pressure of their steps earlier, or maybe fate itself. But everyone knew what that sound meant. Another mine had just armed itself. The desert, vast and empty, now felt like a living thing, a predator waiting for a mistake. The SEALs were trained for combat, for chaos, for missions where bullets filled the air. But this was something else entirely. This was psychological warfare of the purest kind, the kind that tested not your strength, but your patience, your precision, your control over every heartbeat. The silence grew heavier, and the tension cut deeper than any wound. The realization settled among them like dust. They were trapped, not by enemies with guns, but by the invisible ghosts of war buried beneath their boots. Every man looked to the other, searching for direction, for a sign of what to do next. No one had an answer. The only certainty was that one more mistake would be their last. The sun had dipped lower in the horizon, staining the desert in tones of amber and blood. The SEAL team remained frozen in position, still surrounded by the unseen threat beneath their boots. The initial blast had silenced the air, but what followed was worse, a suffocating quiet filled with uncertainty. Their radio operator, crouched low with the damaged comms pack, tapped at the console again and again. Static. Just static. The signal light blinked red. The main antenna, once their lifeline to command, was bent and cracked, its wiring severed by shrapnel from the explosion. They were completely cut off. No contact, no support, no extraction. The team leader knew what that meant. Without communication, they were invisible to headquarters. No one knew their location had changed. No one knew they were trapped in a minefield. Their operations clock had expired, and the extraction team would assume they were compromised or worse. Protocol dictated silence after mission failure, but silence in this situation meant death. He reached for his secondary transmitter, trying to reroute through backup frequency, but the signal wouldn't pass. The enemy's jamming tower, somewhere within 10 kilometers, was still active, its interference blanketing all military frequencies in the region. They were talking into a void. The medic whispered a short report. The wounded man's pulse was weak, his breathing shallow. The blood loss was becoming critical, but there was no way to call for a medevac. Every moment without communication reduced their options, stripping away the last remnants of structure and control. Their water supply was running low. The batteries on their equipment were draining fast in the heat. Without a signal, even their GPS units began to flicker and fail, struggling to synchronize with satellites under the interference. The men were now ghosts in the sand, untraceable even to their own side. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing minute. No one dared to speak above a whisper. Every voice carried risk, not just of being heard by enemies, but of breaking the fragile focus that kept them alive. Each operator stared at the horizon, scanning for movement, for shapes against the sun. The wind picked up, shifting the top layer of sand, and with every gust came the fear that the hidden mines beneath might shift too. The radio operator looked up from his equipment, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He shook his head once. The leader didn't ask. He already knew. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, mocking them with its silence. They had been trained to handle isolation, to operate deep in enemy territory with minimal support, but this was different. This wasn't strategy. This was abandonment by circumstance. Every instinct told them to move, but logic screamed to stay still. Without communication, without coordinates, even one step could lead them deeper into the trap. Somewhere beyond the dunes, they could hear faint echoes, the rhythmic pulse of distant engines. Possibly an enemy patrol, maybe just the wind carrying sound from miles away. The uncertainty gnawed at them. If they could contact command, they could request air reconnaissance, a thermal scan, a signal intercept, anything to give them bearings. But the sky above them remained empty. The mission clock ticked onward. Their silence was the same as disappearance. The team leader took a slow breath, scanning each of his men. Their faces told the same story: exhaustion, dehydration, fear restrained only by discipline. He tapped his wrist, signaling for time. It had been 5 hours since the explosion. 5 hours of stillness. 5 hours of trying to fix the broken communication system with fragments of wire and prayer. The desert had already begun to change, the once burning air now cooling with the coming dusk. Shadows lengthened, stretching like cracks across the sand. The comms specialist pulled out a flare gun from his vest, a last resort for signaling in emergencies. The leader shook his head immediately. A flare would give away their position to any watching eyes, and with the enemy's territory so close, it would be an open invitation for disaster. Without the ability to send encrypted coordinates or authenticate identity, even friendly forces might misinterpret the signal. The flare went back into the pouch. In the distance, a faint line of black smoke curled upward where the mine had detonated earlier. The medic's voice trembled as she spoke, barely audible. He's not going to make it much longer. The team's morale began to fray. Their minds, trained for precision under pressure, began to run through every possible option, none of them safe. They had no satellite link, no drone coverage, and no way to request extraction. The mission brief had listed multiple fallback points, but with the GPS jammed, even those coordinates were useless. The sound of static became unbearable, a reminder of everything they had lost. The operator tried switching to short-range manual transmission, cycling through old field frequencies, hoping maybe, just maybe, one would break through the interference. The speaker hissed, buzzed, then went dead again. The sand swallowed the sound whole, leaving nothing but the thump of distant wind. The failure hung heavy in the air. The team's eyes met once more, a silent exchange of understanding. They were now completely on their own. The outside world had vanished, and with it went their chain of command, their support, their safety net. The desert stretched out endlessly around them, a graveyard of silence. Communication was life, and that lifeline had been cut, leaving only the brutal reality of isolation pressing against their lungs like the desert heat. As the hours dragged on, the silence became heavier than the weight of their gear. The SEAL team remained frozen in a circle of uncertainty, surrounded by invisible death beneath their boots. The sun had disappeared behind the dunes, and darkness crept in slowly, swallowing the horizon in shades of gray and gold. The desert, once burning and bright, now turned cold and indifferent. Shadows stretched long across the sand, and the faint light from their tactical lamps danced against the shifting terrain. With every passing second, tension grew thicker, feeding on fear, fatigue, and the gnawing awareness that no one was coming. The wounded man's breathing had turned shallow and uneven. The medic pressed a trembling hand against his chest, feeling the weak rhythm that struggled to keep him alive. Her lips moved without sound, whispering words she didn't even realize she was saying. The leader crouched beside her, his jaw set hard, eyes scanning the endless expanse ahead. There was no sign of enemy movement, no light, no sound. Only the wind, carrying with it the whispers of sand that fell like ash over their boots. The desert was a cruel kind of silent, not peaceful, but heavy, alive, watching. The men had been trained to operate under pressure, to adapt, to survive the impossible. But the psychological strain of stillness, of being trapped without motion or sound, was a different kind of warfare. Their muscles ached from staying frozen. Sweat dried into salt lines across their uniforms. Every breath felt deliberate, measured. Every blink, every small adjustment, came with the fear that it might be the one movement that set off a chain reaction of explosions. Time seemed to fold in on itself, minutes stretching into hours, and the desert sky began to fill with stars that glittered coldly above the silence of men who could not move. The leader checked his watch again. 6 hours since the blast. 6 hours without communication. 6 hours of uncertainty that had started to eat away at morale. The human mind, no matter how disciplined, begins to drift in such moments. Thoughts of home, of the mission, of the meaning of survival began to clash inside their heads. The youngest among them, barely 25, stared into the distance, his breathing shallow. The sand seemed to shift unnaturally, small ridges forming where there shouldn't be any. The desert was alive with illusion, playing tricks on the eyes of exhausted men. Every so often, one of them would glance toward the medic and the wounded soldier, then back toward the leader. No one spoke, but their expressions asked the same silent question: how long can we wait? The answer never came. The leader's mind was split between strategy and fear, calculating angles, wind direction, terrain, trying to find a path out, but every calculation led back to the same truth. Any movement risked death. Any delay risked the same. The wind picked up again, sharper this time, carrying a faint metallic scent. The shifting sands revealed small glimmers beneath the surface, fragments of old shrapnel, remnants of wars long past, buried and forgotten until now. The mines were not new. They were relics of another conflict, left behind and forgotten by those who once fought here. Now, they had become part of the landscape, silent, patient, and deadly. The men knew that even their footsteps had weight enough to decide their fate. The medic finally looked up, her face streaked with grime and sweat. "We need to move him," she whispered, but her voice barely reached the leader's ears. He met her gaze and shook his head slowly. He knew she was right, but movement was suicide. The internal war between logic and emotion was tearing through him. Every instinct as a commander told him to keep his men safe, to make decisions that ensured survival. Every instinct as a human being told him that leaving a man to die without trying was unthinkable. The tension spread like wildfire through the group. The silence wasn't just around them now. It was inside them, in their chests, in their thoughts. Fear wasn't loud. It was quiet, creeping, subtle. It came in the form of hesitation, in the stilled hands of a soldier afraid to reach for his weapon, in the breath caught between decision and regret. One wrong sound, one false move, and everything would end in an instant. Their water was nearly gone. The desert wind cut cold against their exposed faces. One of the men tried to scan the terrain with night vision, but the static interference from the damaged battery made the screen flicker like a dying heartbeat. Even technology had turned against them. The stars above gave no comfort. They were distant, indifferent witnesses to human struggle. The longer they waited, the more fragile the line between composure and panic became. Small things began to feel magnified: the creak of a strap, the shifting of sand under a knee, the faint rasp of a soldier's breath. Every sound carried weight. Every silence carried dread. The leader could feel morale slipping, not in chaos, but in resignation. Fear wasn't breaking them loudly. It was eroding them quietly. The thought of being left behind began to creep into their minds. Each man silently wondered if command had already written them off, if they would ever be found, if their names would ever be spoken again. The desert seemed to press closer with each thought, its silence almost mocking. The once steady bond between teammates began to fray beneath the pressure. Trust was still there, but beneath it lay exhaustion, despair, and the heavy realization that courage wasn't always loud or visible. Sometimes it was the act of staying still, of holding your breath and waiting for the world to give you a chance to move again. Night had fallen completely, casting the desert into a quiet abyss of black and blue. The SEAL team remained motionless, their bodies tense and rigid against the cold sand. The stars above were sharp and unblinking, indifferent to the human struggle unfolding below them. Their wounded teammate lay in the center of the formation, his breathing faint, his face pale in the dim light. The medic knelt beside him, her hands trembling from exhaustion and the unbearable weight of helplessness. Every breath from the injured man was a ticking clock, counting down the seconds they didn't have. The leader scanned the perimeter through his night scope, his mind a storm of calculation and doubt. There was no safe way forward, no confirmed exit, no communication with command. The longer they waited, the colder the night became, and with every gust of wind, the shifting sands whispered like ghosts. It was in this silence, thick with fear and fading hope, that she, the only female operative in the team, began to move her hand slowly toward the map board clipped to her vest. Her name was buried under her rank and call sign, but among her brothers in arms, she had always been the calm in chaos. Tonight, even calm felt like rebellion. She studied the terrain under the faint red light of her wrist lamp, tracing lines and coordinates with her gloved finger. Her movements were deliberate, steady. She was running calculations in her head, matching memory with instinct, comparing the visible dunes to the contour lines burned into her mind from pre-mission briefings. She knew there had been an old supply route in this region decades ago, long before the war, and if her memory served, that route had once been cleared for vehicle transport. If there was any chance of finding a safe path, it would be there. But the problem wasn't finding the route, it was getting there. Between them and that line of safety lay hundreds of meters of potential explosives buried beneath unstable sand. The leader noticed her movements, but said nothing. He could see the determination in her eyes, the kind that didn't need words. He had seen it before, in missions that demanded decisions no one wanted to make. She looked up briefly, her gaze steady, and then back down at the map. Around her, the others were silent, exhausted shadows trying to hold on to discipline and faith. She could feel their fear. It hung in the air like a living thing. But beneath it, she could also feel something else: trust. Fragile, wordless, but real. She adjusted her earpiece, knowing it was useless, then exhaled slowly. The weight of the situation pressed hard on her chest, but beneath that weight, something in her mind began to clear. She wasn't thinking about survival anymore. She was thinking about motion, about control, about reclaiming the one thing the minefield had taken from them, the ability to move. Her pulse slowed as she visualized the ground in front of her, step by step, meter by meter. Every grain of sand could hold danger, but hesitation had already become a greater threat than the mines themselves. The medic looked up at her, sensing the change in energy. Their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between them. Understanding, resolve, and the quiet acceptance that someone had to act. The team leader noticed it too. He whispered a warning, barely audible, telling her to hold position. But she didn't respond. Not out of defiance, but because she knew words couldn't change what needed to happen. Her training replayed in her head, every lesson drilled into her muscle memory. Movement in uncertain terrain, weight distribution, observation of displacement patterns in sand. She recalled missions where she'd had to navigate booby-trapped paths under fire, where hesitation meant death. This was no different, except that this time, no one would clear the way for her. This time, she would have to be the one to take the first step. The air was cold now, cutting into her lungs as she inhaled. The night pressed closer, the stars watching like distant witnesses. She took off her pack slowly, setting it down beside the medic, and then unhooked a length of paracord from her vest. The cord was standard issue, light, strong, used for climbing or extraction, but tonight, it would serve a different purpose. She tied one end around her waist and handed the other end to the team leader. His expression said everything he couldn't bring himself to voice. She didn't need his permission, she just needed his acknowledgement. He gripped the cord tight, his knuckles pale under his gloves. She nodded once, a small, steady motion, and began to shift her weight forward. Every movement was deliberate, almost ritualistic. The sand beneath her boot whispered as she pressed it down, distributing her weight slowly, evenly, like a predator stalking unseen prey. Every sense sharpened. Every heartbeat echoed like thunder in her ears. She placed her foot down, inch by inch, feeling for resistance, for the unnatural density that signaled buried metal. Nothing, just soft sand. The others watched in silence, barely breathing, their eyes locked on her silhouette against the starlit horizon. The medic clutched the wounded man's arm as if her grip alone could hold him here long enough to see what would happen next. The leader's hand remained clenched around the cord, ready to pull her back at the slightest sign of danger. Another step, then another, each one a defiance of fear, a challenge to death itself. She wasn't reckless. She was precise, methodical, but brave in the way that only those who've accepted the risk of dying can be. The desert seemed to hold its breath with her. The night was so still that even the wind refused to move. She knew every step could be her last. But she also knew that without movement, they would all die here, slowly, quietly, forgotten beneath the same sands that had swallowed soldiers before them. So she kept moving, one cautious, steady step at a time, her breath measured, her focus unbroken, her will. The first step had been taken, and the world didn't end. For a heartbeat, no one moved, no one spoke. The sound of sand shifting beneath her boot echoed in their ears like thunder. The SEAL team held their breath as she froze, waiting for the impossible silence that followed. The air around them seemed to pulse with tension, as though the entire desert had paused to watch what would happen next. Then, slowly, she took another step. Every movement was deliberate, her balance centered, her senses heightened to a level beyond thought. Her eyes scanned the ground ahead, searching for the faintest change in color, the smallest unnatural shape, the whisper of metal beneath the sand. She knew that in terrain like this, survival wasn't just about skill. It was about intuition, the silent conversation between body and earth. The paracord tied to her waist trailed behind her, pulled tight in the leader's grip, a fragile lifeline connecting courage to those still frozen behind. She advanced inch by inch, her boots pressing shallow impressions into the soft terrain. Each step sent tiny clouds of dust swirling upward, catching faint light from the stars. Her breathing was steady, measured through clenched teeth, the rhythm of control against chaos. The others watched, their nerves stretched thin, each heartbeat synchronized with her footsteps. For the first time in hours, something was changing. Fear, though still heavy, began to shift, no longer the suffocating paralysis of hopelessness, but the kind of fear that follows faith. Behind her, the wounded man's breathing grew weaker. The medic knelt beside him, whispering steady words that were meant as comfort, though her own hands trembled. The leader's eyes never left the figure ahead. He had seen acts of courage before, in fire, in blood, in chaos. But this was different. This was courage born from silence, the kind that didn't demand recognition, the kind that simply existed because it had to. Step by step, she began to create a path. With every inch of progress, the possibility of survival grew more real. Her movements were slow but confident, like a rhythm she alone could hear. She stopped briefly, crouching low to study a section of ground that looked disturbed. Her gloved hand brushed gently over the surface, revealing a faint metallic glint. A mine, half exposed by erosion, still lived. She froze, her pulse pounding in her ears, then shifted her weight backward, pressing her heel lightly into the sand to redistribute pressure. The others watched, unable to breathe. She reached into her vest, drew out a small marker beacon, and placed it gently near the spot to warn those who would follow. Her discipline was absolute. The desert wind returned, whispering over the dunes, erasing her footprints as she moved. It felt almost cruel, as if nature itself was mocking her effort, but she didn't stop. Every foot of progress became a silent act of rebellion against the odds. Her mind was empty of fear now, focused only on motion, precision, and survival. She was mapping safety one heartbeat at a time. Minutes bled into hours. The cold night air bit through her uniform, but adrenaline kept her hands steady. The paracord stretched farther, the tension on it growing as the distance widened. The team leader slowly advanced to keep it taut, anchoring her effort without pulling her back. The medic kept whispering, the wounded man fading but still alive, each breath now measured against the sound of her footsteps in the distance. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she paused. The terrain ahead began to shift, the density of the sand changed, and small rocks appeared scattered across the surface. It was the sign she'd been searching for. Old terrain, hardened and compacted, where mines were less likely to have been buried. The map in her head aligned with reality. They were close to the edge of the danger zone. Her instincts told her that beyond this ridge, the ground would be safe enough to establish a path for extraction. She turned slightly, her eyes meeting the faint outlines of her team in the darkness behind her. The wind had picked up, carrying sand through the air, blurring the line between shadow and movement. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in hours: hope. Not certainty, not relief, but the fragile, flickering spark of belief that they might make it out alive. The leader tightened his grip on the cord, his heart pounding. He wanted to shout, to tell her to stop, to wait, but his voice caught in his throat. He knew she wouldn't. She had crossed the threshold where fear no longer ruled, where instinct had taken control. This was what leadership looked like in its purest form. Not rank or command, but the willingness to go first, to bear the risk so others might have a chance to follow. She began marking the safe path back with small signal tabs, pressing them into the sand with gloved fingers. Each one was a promise, a direction, a trail, a way home. The desert around her was still and vast, the stars above cold and endless, but she kept moving, her silhouette cutting through the darkness like a shadow of defiance. The others waited for her signal, their nerves stretched between terror and awe. The sound of her last step seemed to echo louder than the rest. The cord loosened slightly, and the leader knew she had stopped. For a brief second, silence reclaimed the desert once more. She stood still, her breath forming faint clouds in the cold night air, eyes fixed ahead at the faint glimmer of open terrain. Behind her, 6 lives hung in the balance, tethered to her courage, waiting for the next signal that would decide their fate. Unshaken against the endless dark, the desert nights stretched endlessly, the cold cutting through their uniforms, the stars glimmering like shards of glass scattered across an infinite black sky. The SEAL team remained motionless, watching the faint silhouette of their teammate in the distance. She stood at the edge of the minefield, the paracord line still taut around her waist, a living link between death and the possibility of life. The wind whispered softly, shifting sand in small spirals around their boots, erasing the faint trail she had carved with so much precision. Her body was still, her breathing steady, but her eyes moved constantly, scanning, calculating, memorizing every mark she had left behind. The team leader could feel his heart pounding against his ribs. Every instinct urged him to move, to go to her, to pull her back, but he knew better. Movement was risk. She had done what no one else had dared to. She had broken the paralysis that had gripped them for hours. The others watched her too, silent, their faces ghostly under the pale starlight. There was no cheering, no whispered words of hope, only the kind of respect that exists between soldiers who understand what courage truly means. She began to move again, this time retracing her own path. Her boots pressed carefully into the same shallow footprints she had made earlier, each step taken with the same calm precision. The desert seemed to be holding its breath with her. Every grain of sand was a reminder of how close death lingered, how fragile life had become. The paracord tightened slightly as she drew closer, her silhouette growing clearer in the dark. She was coming back, and with her came something the team had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope wasn't a shout or a spark. It was quiet, deliberate, and steady, just like her steps. The medic leaned over the wounded man again, brushing sand from his face. His breathing was shallow, uneven, the sound of someone trapped between pain and surrender. She looked toward the approaching figure, her voice cracking as she whispered his name, as if saying it might keep him tethered to the living. The leader didn't speak. He kept his eyes locked on the woman walking toward them, each step a silent defiance of the desert's will to consume them. When she reached the edge of the group, no one moved at first. Her face was streaked with dust, her lips cracked from the dry air, but her eyes were bright, not with relief, but with resolve. She knelt in front of the team leader and drew a rough line in the sand with her gloved finger. The path she had taken, the markers she had set, the safe corridor she had mapped. It wasn't perfect, but it was a way out, a fragile line between destruction and escape. The leader studied it for a long moment, his breath slow and heavy. The others leaned in, their eyes flicking between her face and the map she had traced. No one needed to say it aloud. They had a chance now, a way forward. The medic nodded once, clutching her kit tighter, preparing to move the wounded man. The silence that followed was no longer the silence of fear. It was focus, purpose, unity. The desert hadn't changed, but something in them had. She looked back toward the horizon, her gaze steady, scanning the distance for signs of enemy movement. There was none. The night was still theirs for now. Her muscles ached, her body screamed for rest, but her mind refused to stop. She had taken the first step when everyone else froze, and now she would lead the rest through the path she'd carved. Her courage had become their direction. The team leader reached out and rested his hand briefly on her shoulder. No words, no rank, just acknowledgement. She gave a small nod and turned her eyes back toward the marked path. The wounded man groaned softly as the medic and another soldier prepared to lift him. Every sound was measured, every motion calculated. The woman adjusted her gear, checked her weapon, then looked at the others. Her voice was low, steady, barely above a whisper, but it cut through the cold like a command. She told them where to step, where not to. She told them to trust the marks, to trust her. They followed her lead. One by one, they began to move. Each man placed his foot in the same print she had made, each motion a mirror of hers. The medic, carrying the wounded man's weight with help, followed carefully, her movements trembling but sure. The leader came last, his eyes sweeping constantly, his hand gripping the cord as though it carried the very thread of their lives. The night swallowed their sound, leaving only the faint crunch of boots on sand and the slow rhythm of breath against the endless quiet. The further they moved, the clearer the stars became overhead, unbroken by smoke or dust. The desert, once their enemy, seemed to open before them, its deadly silence turning into a strange kind of witness. Every step they took was written over her courage, carved into the earth by trust. When they reached the last marker, she stopped. The team behind her froze, waiting. Ahead of them stretched the open terrain she had seen before, solid ground, unmarked, safe. The air was cold and still, the horizon faintly glowing with the promise of dawn. The medic fell to her knees, clutching the wounded man's hand, her breath shaking with exhaustion and disbelief. The others stared at the open sand, unable to speak. The woman stood there at the front, motionless, her boots half buried in the cold earth. Behind her, 6 lives stood alive because she had taken that first step, because she had chosen to act when everyone else had been trapped between fear and silence. The night held its breath one final time, and the desert, indifferent and endless, bore witness to the quiet triumph of human will, courage that had not shouted, but simply walked forward through the dark.